Hello everyone, I'm back with another Marvel Legends action figure set review, and this time it's a slight departure for the line because they're doing something that they haven't really done before. They're venturing into the territory of the arcade games of the late 80s and very early 90s, and they've selected for their first outing, and what I hope will be more outings, is the X-Men arcade game, which is quite legendary in its own right. This was a side-scrolling punch 'em up, similar to games like Streets of Rage that would come a little bit later, only of course set in the X-Men universe, and one of the key opponents that you'd have to battle through, and quite a lot of these, would be Sentinels. And these Sentinels for the game were scaled down quite considerably to what we'd seen in the comic books up until this point, which tended to be giant robots. Here they were scaled down to more human size, and they had a very distinct look. Whilst it was very similar to what you'd recognise as a Sentinel, they had their own colour palette and they had their own design, which was specific to this game, and that's what Marvel Legends are giving us this time around. So quite unexpected, a little bit left field, but then you don't have to be a huge fan of the arcade game to really appreciate some extra Sentinels in your collection. I love my Sentinels, I don't care what scale they're in. I always love this design, so I certainly am not complaining about having an army builder set in my hands. So without further ado, let's kick off by taking a look at this packaging. They've opted for the smaller cardboard packaging that we typically see on the Spider-Man animated series line, where they have two figures in those sets. They usually take this approach when they're trying to be plastic free, but that actually isn't the case with this set. As we'll see inside, the interior plastic is still there. So I think they've purely done this for space saving considerations and for aesthetic design. And I think it is quite nice that you actually could stack this up on your shelf with your Spider-Man sets, and it would be similar, although obviously in terms of the design and layout, very different. And speaking of that design and layout, they have opted for some images that are in the style of the arcade game, including the fuzziness and the blockiness that goes along with that. And I think this is actually really quite cool. It is largely text-free on the front there. We just have the X-Men logo, which is great, and this fantastic image of a Sentinel just blasting us is really quite striking. And I love the colour design, and of course it is authentic to the design that we see in the game, which is lovely stuff. If we flip it and look at the side, both panels are identical, although they are mirroring each other, so it does look like a wraparound if you were to pull it apart, and it's really cool. Of course, we have the Sentinel here lifting the boulder. That's significant because, of course, we do get a boulder as part of the accessories in this set, and I think this is a really cool design. So I actually really like this approach. I think this works really, really well. If we flip it and look at the back of the packaging, we have an image of the two figures, including some of their accessories. It is boasting that these are 7.2 inches tall, so a little bit bigger than our standard 6-inch scale figures, and they have created a background Photoshop job there taken from the arcade game, which is very, very cool. So to access your figures, there is a top lid which simply lifts up. You can pull out the interior plastic, as I mentioned before, and you'll see that the two Sentinels are layered together in two sheets of plastic here to keep all their bits and pieces together. So they are nice and snug, nice and secure, and much easier, and tend to replicate what we see with our typical Marvel Legends when they're single carded. And this removes all the faff that we used to have with the cardboard and the rice paper, which is very fiddly, especially when you want to put your figures back into the packaging. This is much easier. So the first thing to note about this figure when you get him out of the packaging is just how bright and colourful he is, and this is pitch perfect in my opinion. I think this looks really, really good. This head sculpt looks to be brand new. I don't recall seeing this before. In fact, I don't recall seeing a more traditional looking Sentinel in this scale. I know we've had a few humanoid Sentinels and different variants like that, but I mean a traditional classic Sentinel in this scale, we've never really had one. So this looks like a brand new sculpt to me, and I have to say they've done a really nice job with the paint apps on the face there. It's actually got that slight pixelated quality that you'd see from a computer game of the time, which is great, but it looks quite detailed and it's very nicely coloured, and it works really, really well. Sadly, there's not a lot else when it comes to the paint apps virtually anywhere else on this figure. The only exception being the yellow points on the chest, on the belt, and some of the detail that's painted in on the torso, and that's basically it. The rest of the colour comes exclusively through the plastic that it is moulded in, and it's bright, it's colourful. I think it works an absolute treat for the most part, but I think given the source material, maybe it would have been appropriate to have some cell shading. That could have been their way in to just give it a little bit more depth and texture, but as it is, I really like that it's bright and colourful, and this looks really good to me, so I'm actually quite happy. The only thing I wanted to point out though, much like we just saw with the recent She-Hulk figure, is that the elbow joints and the kneecaps, the plastic they've used there, the colorization is slightly off-tone to the rest of the limbs, and it does stand out a little bit. Now here, it works a little bit better than it did with She-Hulk. It's not quite as obvious, but it is still a little bit distracting, and I think it's most distracting on the elbows. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think they're using a lot of new parts on this figure, both the cuffs, obviously the torso, the head sculpt, but even the bell bottoms. I did think at first that they'd simply just recycled the recent Iron Man version 9 or Armor 9 figure that we just had, but actually that isn't the case. These are very slightly and very subtly different. They're thinner, a little bit longer, and even the shoes or the feet of this figure are slightly different as well. So a lot of this figure appears to be brand new to my eyes. Looking at the articulation then, he does have a straight swivel at the neck, and that's it. It's not a ball joint, so he can't really pivot his head from side to side, and he can't look up or down, which is strange. He does have ball joints in the shoulders though, which will lift up and out all the way, which is great. He has a very straight swivel at the bicep cut there. He has a double joint at the elbow, so he can get his hands all the way back to his head, more or less. And he's got the standard pin swivel at the wrist there, so of course the hand will rotate all the way around, and it will hinge forwards and backwards. Although mine was pretty stiff, and it was a little bit reluctant to work with me, but it has the standard range of motion you'd expect. He's got another straight swivel, this time at the waist, so of course he can rotate all the way around. He does thankfully have a ball joint in the upper torso though, which is great. So again, he can swivel from side to side, he can lean left and right, a pretty healthy distance there as well. And he can just about bend forwards and backwards as well. It's not a huge range of motion in truth, but it is something, which is good. Now, he's got the ball joints in the hips as you'd expect, so they do kick out to the side. There's a straight swivel at the top of the thigh there. There's another one at the top of the boot cut, which is great. The legs should move forwards and backwards, but mine don't. There's a real sense of resistance here to this that's very uncomfortable and won't really let me pose him at all, which is a shame. Then he's got a double joint at the knee, of course, and he's got a ball joint in the foot, which is quite limited, but it will let him wobble it up and down a little bit. So what other bits and pieces do we get with these Sentinels? Well, we get an additional pair of open palm hands, 2 repulsor blast effects, and we get 1 rock effect. And I believe that this is the first time we've ever had a world-building piece quite like this with a Marvel Legends set. It's certainly the first time I've seen a big rock included, which is kind of cool. And thinking about it, I'm surprised we haven't had this before with, say, the Incredible Hulk, for example. This is very, very different. Now, it's all one piece, although it does look like it's been welded together with the base there, which does look a little bit unseemly, a bit obvious. I'm not quite sure why, since it is mostly hollow, very lightweight, but it is nicely molded, and it has, some decent texturing to it as well, although, again, not an awful lot in the way of paint apps. Now, getting your Sentinel to hold this is a bit more challenging. There isn't a specific way of doing it with specific grips or grooves for him to get his fingers into, so it really comes down to perseverance, a little bit of ingenuity, I suppose, and of course, a heck of a lot of balance as well. I have found it quite helpful to actually rest it on his head in certain places, but obviously you can use this either way. You can have it flat or you can turn it upside down, and that gives you a few more gripping options, but I wouldn't say it's a very snug fit, and of course you're going to have to persevere with this. As for the repulsor blast, well, we've all seen this before. Of course, they fit snugly into the palm there, and they look pretty cool. We've seen this on many Iron Man figures in the past, so nothing particularly new here, although I do have to say I really do like that they've gone for 2 tones here in the blast, the red of the main beam and then the yellow of the corona of the blast. And of course, it should be mentioned, although I haven't videoed it, they can also slip into the soles of the feet as well to create that sort of repulsion, that uplift effect as well. And then finally, before I wrap up for today, I did want to do a quick scale comparison here because this figure is slightly tall. I did mention that it's just 7.2 inches tall, so slightly bigger than your standard 6-inch figure. So here he is standing next to a recent Iron Man figure to give you a sense of that scale. And as you can see, he's just fractionally taller there, just stands head and shoulders above Iron Man. Okay, so final thoughts from me. I'm going to give this set 4 stars. Overall, I think this is a really nice set. We're getting an awful lot of new pieces here in terms of the sculpting and the design, which is great. I really like the paint apps on the face in particular. I like that we're straying into some slightly different territory here, looking at the arcade games, which is something they've not really done in the line ever before. And we get some really fun accessories here, including that big rock there, which just feels a little bit different. So all in all, I feel like we're getting a lot of new things with this particular release, and I think the presentation of it all round, including the packaging, is actually very nice. Where I'm removing a star though is massively for that articulation issue that we have with the legs. Like, I cannot get my figures to kick their legs forwards at all, which really hampers and limits my ability to create some interesting poses, any action sets you want to create in terms of dioramas, etc. You're going to be very limited here, and I really don't want to force it for fear of snapping a joint. That's not something I want to do. So maybe you could get a bit more with this if you're a bit more forceful, but I'm not feeling it, and that really hampers this. I think my other criticism, and it's pretty standard these days for most figures in this scale, it seems, in the industry, but we are not seeing an awful lot in the way of paint washes that would really just enhance these figures in terms of that presentation. As it is, they're bright and colourful though, and I think it works absolutely fine, and I think this is a solid entry if you're a fan of the arcade game or just a big fan of Sentinels. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider giving the video a like. That kind of thing really does help the channel out, and it allows me to keep making more content. And if you're interested in seeing more content, remember to hit subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos coming soon.